Then there was the supreme hour, all auspicious and most suitable, with the constellation of Rahini rising, and all the stars and planets in a favorable position. Everywhere was peace. The multitude of stars twinkled in the sky, and cities, towns, pasturing grounds, and mines were at their best. The minds of the saintly, oppressed as they had been by the Asura, Kamsa and his men, turned perfectly contented when in that situation the kettle drums together resounded with the unborn one to be born. Twinkling stars in the sky are far from the biblical account of a star in the east signaling Jesus' birth. In the film Zeitgeist, author Edward Carpenter is cited for providing this information on Krishna's supposed miracles and resurrection. Carpenter, in his book Pagan and Christian Creeds, stated, "To go into the parallelism of the careers of Krishna, the Indian sun god, and Jesus would take too long, because indeed the correspondence is so extraordinarily elaborate." He then cites Robertson's Christianity and Mythology as a reference. Then Robertson transcribes the outline of the well-known Krishna saga as follows. The son of Devaki, the two brothers grew up in the midst of the shepherds, slaying monsters. Arrived at adolescence, the two brothers put to death Kamsa, and Krishna became king. He continued to clear the land of monsters. After having been present at the death of his brother, he himself perished, wounded in the heel by the arrow of a hunter. Thus we read in the well-known Krishna saga that there is no virgin birth, no star, and no miracles. The comparisons are not so extraordinarily elaborate after all. Robertson also stated, "The case in favor of the assumption of Christian priority has been in a general way strengthened by the precise investigation of Hindu literature, which has gone to show that much of it, as it stands, is of far later redaction than had once been supposed." Thus, Zeitgeist cites Carpenter, and Carpenter cites Robertson, who admits that Hindu literature is of much later publication than previously assumed, and therefore any similarities between Christianity and Hinduism were borrowed by the Hindus and not vice versa. In the long Indian epic poem, the Mahabharata, Book 16, there is an account of the death of Krishna. It reads, "Having restrained all his senses, speech, and mind, Krishna laid himself down in high yoga. A fierce hunter of the name of Jara then came there, desirous of a deer. The hunter, mistaking Krishna for a deer, pierced him at the heel with a shaft and quickly came to the spot for capturing his prey. Coming up, Jara beheld a man dressed in yellow robes, wrapped in yoga, and endued with many arms. Regarding himself an offender and filled with fear, he touched the feet of Krishna. The high-souled one comforted him and then ascended upwards, filling the entire welkin with splendor. Krishna died and ascended, but there is still no resurrection, as claims Zeitgeist. It's hard to imagine how this blue Indian man could be mistaken for Jesus, or a deer for that matter. The only similarity we have here is an ascension, which is not even mentioned in Zeitgeist. Even if you do want to take Zeitgeist's premise that the ascension account might have been borrowed, then who borrowed from who? The earliest testimony for the complete text of the Mahabharata dates to the 1st century AD by the Greek sophist Dion Chrysostom. The available accounts of Dionysus' birth indicate that Dionysus was not born of a virgin. In the best-known myth, Dionysus was born through an affair between Zeus and a princess. In another version, Zeus mated with his daughter Persephone, and she bore Dionysus. Dr. Edwin Yamauchi, professor of history at Miami University, confirms, there is no evidence of a virgin birth for Dionysus. As the story goes, Zeus, disguised as a human, fell in love with the princess Semele, the daughter of Cadmus, and she became pregnant. Also, not only is December 25th irrelevant to Jesus' birth, there is also no reference to Dionysus being born on December 25th in any scholarly literature. Even some of Zeitgeist's sources, Timothy Freke and Peter Gandy, note that Dionysus' birth was celebrated on January 6th by some in Alexandria, which makes it of no relevance for copycat claims. Indeed, Dionysus was a traveling teacher. At any rate, this is a vague similarity that could be found in most ancient and modern literature concerning any figure with a message to share with others. But there are differences as well. Dionysus wandered the world accompanied with wild women, flushed with wine, shoulders draped with a fawn skin, whereas Jesus traveled the limited area surrounding Jerusalem, providing moral teachings. Though there are accounts of Dionysus filling empty vessels with wine, there is no reference to Dionysus turning water into wine, as Zeitgeist claimed. And it is not surprising that Dionysus performed miracles involving wine, since he was the god of wine. One historical study explains, the ancient literature says that there was a spring with clear, sparkling, wine-colored water, very pleasant-tasting water in which the newly born Dionysus was bathed. Also, a spring in the temple flowed with wine. At Elis, the priests of Dionysus placed 3 large empty cauldrons in a sealed room to find them filled with wine when they returned the next day. However, from these references, it is obvious that there are significant differences between the Dionysus legend and the story in John 2. The spring flowed with water, and the one at Andros flowed with wine, not wine that had once been water. And the empty cauldrons in the Elis temple were filled with wine rather than water subsequently changed into wine. Key elements in John's story. These differences have convinced most scholars that John or his tradition is not dependent on the Dionysus legend for this story. Research professor Dr. Donald A. Carson wrote, older attempts to interpret this sign as a Christianized version of the Dionysus myth or of related stories have largely been abandoned in the light of evidence that the alleged parallels are wholly inadequate. Zeitgeist's source for these titles of Dionysus, Acharya S., only says he was considered the only begotten Son, Alpha and Omega, etc., not that he actually was known by these titles. She has absolutely no source for the title King of Kings, which is a generic term in the first place, and secondly does not even suit Dionysus, since Zeus was the head god according to mythology. Nor does the title Only Begotten Son suit Dionysus, since Zeus had several offspring including Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Hermes, Persephone, Dionysus, Perseus, Heracles, Helen, Minos, and Muses. James Frazer, author of The Golden Bough, is cited in Zeitgeist for this claim of the resurrection. With such an array of options, it may be no surprise that at least one variation bears a superficial resemblance to what happened to Jesus. Still, this vague description does not match with the Jewish concept of resurrection.
You're going to have to give me a date for the earliest inscription, because Dionysus, I don't know anybody who thinks Dionysus is pre-Christian, not the resurrection portion.
Okay, well, all I can tell you is that the myth is that he is torn apart by the Titans, eaten, and he is raised from the dead.
But what is the date?
I don't know. I don't know the date of the, as I said, of the original. As far as any writings we have, but I know that with the myths, the Greek myths, most of our Greek myths, we do have from later collections. Except we know they were told earlier because we have the vase paintings depicting them going way back in time.
But the question is there a resurrection? And since we don't have any resurrection predating the 2nd century all the way to the 4th century, are the earliest ones, 2nd to 4th, we can say, well, maybe there's a resurrection there, but there's no data.
Even Tim Callahan, the skeptic you just saw defending Dionysus, admits there is no crucifixion. Even the skeptic Tim Callahan critiques the movie Zeitgeist, saying, perhaps the worst aspect of Part 1 of Peter Joseph's internet film Zeitgeist is that some of what it asserts is true. Unfortunately, this material is liberally and sloppily mixed with material that is only partially true, and much that is plainly and simply bogus. The evidence for Jesus as a real historical personage, though meager, is solid. Mithra is the only one of these pagan gods mentioned that could have conceivably come in contact with Christianity. As the late Dr. Ronald Nash puts it, Mithra was supposedly born when he emerged from a rock. Unless this rock was a virgin, there is no virgin birth for Mithra. For the last time, December 25th is irrelevant to origins. The claim of Mithra having 12 disciples comes from Zeitgeist sources, Acharya S., Timothy Freak, and Peter Gandy, yet there is no documentation for this claim in their books. Acharya S., Timothy Freak, and Peter Gandy now acknowledge that they got this idea of 12 disciples from a scene where Mithra is framed by 2 vertical rows of 6 pictures of what seems to be human figures and Mithra in the middle. The reliefs come from the 2nd century AD. Even if these reliefs were dated prior to Christianity, the Iranian Mithras had a single companion and the Roman Mithra had two helpers